Hello and welcome to Books Without Barcodes, where I review books published before 1978 because that's when UPC barcodes were mandated on all printed material made available for sale to the general public. I'll be reviewing The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. This is his second novel and considered his best work. And it also won the Nebula Award in 1974, which is why I am reviewing it here. I will state that this book took 4.5 hours for me to read, but months for me to finish, and I will get into that now. So this book follows Private Mandela as he fights in the intergalactic war between humanity and the Taurans. And the Taurans are a race of aliens that don't seem to do war very well, and they were encountered when humans were out looking at space. Private Mandela has been picked to do the first major conflict between the humanity and Taurans, and it goes, in the first third of the book, goes through his training process as well as being assigned to his unit, and also the first battle. This is the first third of the book is where I had to stop reading multiple times. I have a really hard time in general with the military mentality of following orders. You just gotta follow orders. I very much enjoy and appreciate critical thinking skills, and I know in a military unit stopping and asking questions can get people killed, which is why I never joined the military. So I do understand why that is what happens, and in this book they get around that by conditioning their soldiers. So they hyper condition them, one, to follow orders, and two, they sexually condition their soldiers, which is what I had the biggest problem with in the first third of the book as a modern female reader. The heteronormative sexual promiscuity in the first third of the book definitely harkens back to Huxley's Brave New World, where, you know, it's considered a social norm to be promiscuous as possible. Everybody sleeps with everybody. Because it's presented in this military fashion, that is why I had a harder time accepting it in this novel than I did in A Brave New World. I also didn't really like it in A Brave New World, but I felt it was dealt with more delicately than it was here. And that mostly has to do with, there's a point in the book where Mandela's unit ends up having to be waylaid at a station before they make their final jump to where they're going to go and fight the Taurans. And when they get to this way station, there are only 2 haggard females. That is how it's written in this book. 2 haggard females to 19 men. And so when Mandela's unit shows up, which has an even male-female split, the men of the station ran train, and it was a giant orgy, and everybody that was from Mandela's unit just sat around and watched and gave the other 2 women a break. I stopped reading for a few weeks after that section in the book because I got the massive ick. And at that point, I was really debating on not finishing this, on DNFing it. It really made me feel bad. I did not like that. But I did come back to the book, and they had the conflict with the Taurans, and then Mandela ends up coming back to Earth. I will state, Joe Haldeman does have very good prose. He wrote well. The book is written well. And it wasn't until Mandela got back to Earth did things start to progress in a way that was more tolerable and more enjoyable to me. The first third of this book was like a 2 out of 5 stars for me. Like I said, it was low. It was lower than the Einstein Intersection was for me, which is another book I reviewed on the channel, which I was very disappointed in because I loved Babel 17 so much. But the ending saved this book for me. Which moved it up to a 3. The first third of the book was just awful for me. The second third of the book dealt with Haldeman's feelings of not being able to integrate back into life after being in the military, integrating back into civilian life. That second part of the book, you could definitely feel him writing into his struggles about trying to reintegrate to civilian life. And then the last third of the book, where they're dealing with really heavy time dilation, he has a degree in physics. He did an amazing job with the time dilation. I will definitely give that to Haldeman, that the difficulties of space travel and the difficulties of humanity with their short lifespans having to deal with time dilation while they're traveling space, and then how society could change in the time while, like, it could only be years to them, but it's centuries have passed by the time they've come home due to the time dilation and having to travel faster than the speed of light in order to get off to these far off places. Like, he did that very well, and that's very thought-provoking, and I did actually very much appreciate that about this book, and I thought about it a few times since finishing the book, about how well he dealt with that. So at the beginning of the book, he talks about how in order to survive these long space voyages, they have compression tank chambers, which totally fine. We've seen that in modern sci-fi bunches of times, where, you know, you go in a pod and you get into cryogenic sleep or some kind of test tube baby sleep, and then you wake up and you're wherever you were supposed to go. The thing that I had a hard time with is the recycling of waste, and then to re-ingest it, because I don't feel like that would have an infinite recycling, because I feel like some of the matter would not necessarily be lost. It would be converted to energy in the human body, and I feel like if I ate 5 pounds of food and drank a gallon of water, that is not the amount of waste that's going to come out of me while I'm in the suit, because you have to be in the suit. So if you're not in your suit and you are sweating, like if you lost the water from sweating and you're not in the suit, then that's going to be lost to the system. So I don't feel like that could have infinite recycling. I do know that maybe water would be extracted from the air, but I just felt like in my bone that I had a hard time with that, and that might be very nitpicky, that the infinite recycling of matter in that way would not be possible based on the processes of the human body. But that's my personal opinion. And that's only because it's such a stark contrast to how well he dealt with the time dilation, which is why I got hung up on that. But I do know sometimes in these reviews I can be a little pedantic about that. This book was definitely written by someone in the military who is very cynical about the military and is trying to convey that to the general population, and I feel like they do that very well. I have someone who has never been in the military, but I've been around individuals that have been in the military a lot. That definitely rings true. I am very glad that I read this. Like I said, the ending of the book saved this book for me. I actually got emotional and teared up at the end. I'm trying to do this as spoiler-free as possible, but to me that just redeemed a lot of the book, and it went from being a book that I just had to get through to something where I was glad I read it all the way. So I feel like it's worth reading the beginning of the book to get to the interesting matter in the second and third sections of the book. I also always find it really interesting in these vintage sci-fi books when they make predictions for the future. Private Haldeman returns to Earth in the year 2023, which I found very coincidental that I am reading it now in 2023. And that's something else that I always found that I find really interesting. This is probably like the second or third book that I've read, vintage sci-fi book that I've read, where they have made these predictions in the future of around this time period, or into the early 2000s. And they've figured out how to do faster than light travel and to land safely and deal with atmospheric issues and to be in space and interact with aliens. but they haven't figured out how to handle smog. Which just makes me laugh. Now, I do know that recently we've had issues with, here in Virginia, had issues with, Canada being on fire and it looking like an actual hellscape outside. But this is the third time I've read in a vintage sci-fi, like that's what it looks like all the time. And I do know because in the 70s specifically, that's when the EPA was in America was passing a lot of legislation to control that. And I know that that was an issue in other areas of the world as well. And that is why so many climate change in legislations and organizations came into being, was to combat the smog. So I just found that very interesting that that seems to be a reoccurring thing, where we can travel into space and interact with aliens, but we can't figure out how to deal with smog on Earth. We are able to infinitely recycle our shit and piss, but we can't figure out how to deal with smog on Earth. That just is funny to me. And then the other thing that was interesting is that the thought that 9 billion people, that a lot of people would only live in single rooms. I do know that in some areas of the world there are, coffin apartments, and that is definitely a thing that happens, but those are concentrated in the major city, and there's still land for people to be on. We're at, almost 8 billion people now, and there's still giant tracts of land for people to be on. They just choose not to because of lack of convenience and infrastructure, but it's not like it's so crowded in the world that there's just no space for them. And I understand that, at the time this book was written, it was roughly like, 4 billion people, so it's like more than double. And that was just not something that was conceptual at the time, I guess. And I just always find that interesting that we're now at 8 billion people and, there's still plenty of room. There are places where there's not plenty of room, but there is still plenty of room to live and survive. And I find those predictions for the future more interesting than the space bubbles and the colonies on other planets. Sometimes I like to see how the people not even 50, like the people 50 years ago would have thought, the time would be now. And Haldeman's been able to see it. He's been able to see his 2023 predictions. And if you read the book, I think you will get a kick out of that section as well as I did. I was literally writing so many notes when I got to the point where Mandela arrived back on Earth, just because how many things that Haldeman got right and or very close, and how many things he got wrong. But I thought that was pretty great. So I again am very critical of the first third of the book, but I know that that's partly due to my own personal hangups and how and being not a fan of military culture and sometimes the chauvinism within. I don't even know if you can hear this, but Revelry, or is it Taps? I don't know, whatever one plays at 10 o'clock at night is currently playing outside, because I actually live outside of an army base. So like I said, been around plenty of military people. It's just personal hangup. But if you do like military sci-fi and you love vintage sci-fi, this is worth a read, even if it's not very high scoring for me personally. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know some of you, this was a mind-expanding book for you when you originally read it when it came out. It has been very thought-provoking to me. I have my own personal criticisms, like I said, of the first third of the book, but the end of the book definitely redeemed that. So thank you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, bye. Bye.